Some of you may know I recently went over to Google, so this talk is going to be on Google, but hopefully not boring. Start with an announcement. Is John Palmieri here? No? I believe it's his birthday, so tell him J5 happy birthday. If it's not, yeah, he's so old now. He is? Oh, he is old. Tell him happy birthday. I may have totally made this up, though, so if he looks at you weird, just, you know. Second order of business, if you didn't see Brian/Havoc's talk or Alex's talk, both keynotes, or even if you did, you should check out those websites. They're interesting. This is a situation we need to figure out. I think Brian and Havoc were polite. I think it's important. I think when you look at what people are talking about, where users are, where VC money is going, it's on the web. That's what's interesting. That's the platform right now. And open source is my interest, and I don't want us to lose out on that. So we need to figure out what our story is, what our reaction is. Because it doesn't mean we have to just quit, and it doesn't mean we have to take the other polar opposite, which is just ignore it and hope it goes away or say that's not the niche we'll be in. I think we can embrace and provide an open source solution that's pretty sweet. And these are both great starts. Particularly, I think Alex might do another talk as like a second talk. If he didn't yesterday, we should all check that out. Why can you not see that? That looks really dark to me. Can you guys all see that screen? Okay. It just looks dark. Yeah, that's a satellite grid of where we have electricity in the world. And this is a similar picture with where we have searches. So where there's electricity, there are queries. Google uses open source pervasively. So every time you use Google, you use open source. We're used around the world. That's open source is used around the world. Speaking of using Google, this is a real-time display, not real-time, but culled from real-time logs of 24 hours of query statistics. You kind of see patterns of usage. You can see it a little better on the laptop, but you could actually see the DMZ through the Korean Peninsula. That's pretty neat. What can we learn from the data? You can see here the usage spikes in America, France, and Spain. If you look around just after 12, there's a drop in France and Spain. Anyone have a... Well, I mean, America eats lunch too.
Siesta.
Yeah. Siesta?
We ate lunch for like 2
Okay. This is the first Google. The first. It's got some Legos on top of it. This is Google a few years later. It's a boring rack of machines. A few years later, this is Google today. This is one row of maybe 100 in one of maybe some number of data centers, because they don't tell me. In a data center like this, electricity is incredibly important, and so is cooling. This is what happens if the cooling fails. All right, Google and open source. Why the heck am I here today? Google's stated mission is this long, interesting, noble thing about organizing the world's information, putting it somewhere accessible, and making it really, really useful. And along the way, we tend to make it freely available. We do this primarily through services, primarily but not exclusively services that are web-based. We aren't a traditional open source company. I used to be at Novell. We made a Linux distribution. The whole thing was pretty much open source. Google's not in that market. We're not even a traditional company in most ways, but we do embrace open source. And so this talk is going to have 2 points, two things I'm going to speak to. And the first is, okay, how do we use open source software? What does it mean when I say that I actually think Google has a lot of characteristics of an open source company, in some ways is an open source company? One of the most notable is that Google uses open source as our infrastructure. Our servers are Linux servers. All of Google, in fact, is Linux. This includes a whole lot of the Apache system, base Linux system, the Linux kernel. Our system management tools are all SSH. And we use Linux Linux are open source derivative languages such as Python, and obviously the tool chain and compilers, GCC. And so this means something because people have said over the course of this week in the discussions about Web 2.0 that if the web wins, it means Linux loses. But I don't think that's true because the web's built on Linux. Particularly at Google, the web's entirely Linux. So every time that a company moves a service from, say, a Windows-based service to a Google-based service, in a sense, Linux is winning because all of that stuff is running on Linux. So Google uses open source as infrastructure. It's the key of our entire system. We also use open source as a building block for our products. Not demonstrating NIH and not reinventing the wheel, but in our products and our services and even things we ship, we have open source components, we have open source libraries. We build on things that are open source. So, like a lot of places, we use open source as building blocks and components in a larger solution. Pertinent to this conference, we use open source as our desktop. Kubuntu, as most of you probably are familiar with, is Google's internal Linux distribution. It's based on Ubuntu. We trail the latest distribution officially. We try and trail it by about 6 months or so. It's in no way a fork. It's mostly tweaking, customization, pretty pictures, a few new packages. But for the most part, it's an Ubuntu that's been set up so that we can deploy it, manage it, update it. The neat thing about it is the default desktop is GNOME. We have the ability to switch to KDE for people who prefer KDE, but the vast majority of Googlers are using GNOME. And so with whatever is the last official count, 12,000, 13,000 employees, a big chunk of that's engineering. Every engineer runs Linux. Yeah, that's a pretty big GNOME deployment, and that's interesting. And that might be something for a future Guadic to sit down and talk about the trials and tribulations of rolling out Ubuntu and GNOME across an enterprise. Now, the downside is most of our users are engineering, so it's a very technically skewed audience, but it's still a very, very large deployment. And we deploy it in an enterprise setting, so it's not that we have in thousand engineers running Kubuntu that they installed off a CD, but it's actually managed, it's deployed, it's bootstrapped and administered by IT, and they do this all with minimal changes to Ubuntu. So why do we use all this open source? Okay, so we base the company's infrastructure on open source. We use open source in building our other products and solutions. Most of us run Linux. Why? Well, one of probably the most pertinent, the sort of thing that would go all the way up to the board of directors, the sort of thing that we talk about as a business would be control and ownership. It lets us maintain our independence. It lets us control our own destiny. This is a reason a lot of us have gotten into open source, because we want the ability to change the code. We want the ability to do certain things with the product. We want the freedom that entails. Open source is easy to customize. It's easy to change. We like the fact that we can make changes, drill down and change the way software works for our own needs. We could do it ourselves. We have some talented engineers who are capable of doing that. We do a lot of things that we don't necessarily want to show our hand. We want to make changes to the Linux kernel in a way that so that we don't have to go to a vendor, if we were using Windows, and contract with Microsoft to make some, say, power saving changes that shows how we're taking advantage of power saving. We don't want to have to rely on any given vendor. And it's the same thing that hackers and tinkerers get out of open source. Some of probably your first changes as an open source hacker, one of your first contributions, is just a little tweak or a little change to kind of customize something the way you'd like it. Maybe add an option for something that isn't an option. And this is the same reason Google uses open source. We like that adaptability. But at a lower level, at the engineering level, not talking about a big scary business, it appeals to our roots. Google engineers largely come from open source or have some sort of open source background. They've all used Linux. It appeals to the ethics that Googlers have. Our first choice is often, what was there an open source solution? All right, so I talked about how we use a lot of open source software, but how do we participate in the community? Because open source can't be a one-way street. Well, it turns out Google's released over 1 million lines of code. I was shocked to see this number. A few of the more interesting things are the Google Web Toolkit, which is basically a complete infrastructure, all open source, for building a Web 2.0 app. Google Gears, which is a mechanism for doing offline web apps. TC Malloc, which is incredibly fast Malloc implementation. And my personal favorite, Mac Fuse, which is a port of Fuse to the Mac. I spoke at Guadalajara last year. I did 2 talks in one. One was on Network Manager, which is what I was working on at the time. But the second part was on Fuse, which is this thing I played with on the plane ride over. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Fuse, it lets you write a file system in user space. And then you actually mount the file system, and it appears in the Unix file hierarchy. So obviously there's a small kernel component, but everything you write as the developer is in user space. Well, a gentleman at Google, Amit Singh, who is now the director of our Macintosh engineering efforts, has written MacFuse. It's not just Fuse for Mac, but it's actually source compatible. And a large number of Linux Fuse modules I just broke this pen. A large number of Linux Fuse modules just work. And in fact, I got working my first week at Google, Mono and Beagle on a Mac with BeagleFS, which is a Fuse module I wrote last year for my talk that basically shows a Beagle search as a file system, a query, like a search folder. If you go to this address and search for label col in Google, you can see there's about 70 or so projects that have been open sourced. I'll take a quick diversion. During a Havok and Bryant keynote, one of the complaints about why the web will never work for someone was that the web stuff doesn't work offline. Well, that's a solvable problem. I mean, if that's the best argument you have about why the web's not going to work, then that's not a really good one, because it does now. Google Gears is a solution that allows primarily 3 things. One is that application resources can be stored locally, so you could actually run a Web 2.0 app off your hard drive. A second feature is that it implements a MySQL database. I mean, it's actually backend independent, but the current implementation uses a MySQL database for a fully searchable repository of data so that you can store information locally. And then the third is it lets you run JavaScript asynchronously outside of the browser space for better application latency. There's a Firefox extension available. It works on Linux and also works on Mac and that other platform. And the whole thing is open sourced. If you go to code.google.com/API/Gears, you can download the source and contribute. Right now, the Gears-enabled apps are really only useful one as a reader. You can read your blogs offline and then sync them later, but there's more coming. Someone earlier told me, I didn't know this, the story of how Google Reader got implemented for offline, but it was a 20% project, and I guess someone was commuting to Google's Mountain View office from San Francisco on one of those silly shuttles that Google runs that are Wi-Fi enabled, but I guess the Wi-Fi... All right. Thank you very much, everyone. This is actually Jeff Waugh, just pulling a prank. It was actually caused because I realized I've said MySQL earlier, but it's SQLite is the backend that Gears currently uses. And so this was an opportunity for self-review to point that out to me. But I actually knew I was wrong as soon as I said it, and Joe Shaw gave me this look of like I just pooped my pants. Or that he just pooped his pants. All right, we're going to continue right where I left off, and I'm going to go quickly because I want to do some Q&A, but we'll still be fine. You download the thing. It's all open source. It's actually pretty cool, and I think the Firefox guys are doing something similar but not quite the same for Firefox 3.0. So offline apps is going to be something we could all do. Googlers also contribute to a whole bunch of projects, both in their spare time and their 20% time, and as part of their job function. There's a whole big list. Just a couple areas where there's significant Googler contribution, or just to pick one, is Subversion. A large chunk of the Subversion guys, Fitz, Ben Collins Sussman, Greg Stein, who was past president of the Apache Foundation, they all work for Google in a Subversion or Subversion-related project. Google also directly funds several open source developers, and when I say directly funds, I mean these guys work on open source projects as either 100% or some large percent of their day-to-day function. Most notable is probably my dad, Andrew Morton, who is the 2.6 Linux kernel maintainer. He works 100% on, or maybe 99% on the kernel in the open source community, and 1% on sending nasty emails to kernel developers internally who ask him questions. Jeremy Allison's another example. Jeremy Allison and I are actually in the same group, which is the Open Source Program Office. And Jeremy has, he works full-time on Samba. Another way we embrace open source is just by embracing openness. A lot of our services have web APIs. There's SOAP APIs for accessing things. There's data APIs for getting at and poking at services. I originally started going through some of our API docs, which are at code.google.com. You can all check them out. Trying to make a little list, maybe do a little example of some of the stuff we could do, but I realized almost every single one of our services is completely accessible over API. So I stopped making a list. Open formats. We're big on speaking open formats, not just on importing, but also exporting. So we give you an open way to drop us, an exit strategy. Google Calendar exports iCal. Gmail allows you to do a POP3 slurp down. I recently helped someone move from, well, helped. I told my girlfriend she had to move from Yahoo Mail to Google Mail. And Google Mail doesn't do POP3 at all without paying for, I'm sorry, Yahoo Mail doesn't do POP3 at all without paying for Yahoo Mail Plus or something. So your mail's stuck there. Google Mail, Gmail on the other hand, provides POP3 for free. You can pull down all your email. So there's no lock-in. Same with Google Reader. You decide you don't like it, it exports to OPML. Almost all of our services have some sort of exit strategy like that, and I wouldn't be surprised if you saw more and more. Microsoft has this sort of monopoly that exists in the market for a lot of reasons now, but the traditional reason it exists, how they got it in the first place, is API lock-in. And API lock-in is something until the idea of an operating system platform and a software ecosystem, I think no one really understood. Clearly no one saw this coming. It's not explained in the legislature anywhere. But Microsoft has it. They have this API lock-in. Google, on the other hand, has zero lock-in. The transition cost for stopping to use Google search and using a competitor is almost zero. It could actually be less. You could actually have to type a smaller name to get to a search engine than google.com. And we're aware of this, and so we have to constantly fight for your use. And the third way is open protocols. For the most part, Google's web-based, and so we use HTTP. We use SOAP in a few places, and those are all open. But in places where we have to pick a more specific protocol, something other than the web, we try to pick open protocols. The best example is Google Talk, which speaks XMPP or the Jabber. Google Talk has a VoIP service. It uses Jingle, which is an openly available standard. And even better, we've decided that we will federate with anyone who will federate with us. So Google Talk is completely federated using XMPP standards, and you could bridge to any other Jabber service with the right SRV records in your name service, which if you're using Google Talk just works. That's pretty cool. Another way, and I think a really cool way that Google participates in open source is by hosting it. Google provides something called Google Project Hosting at Google Code. It's like Subversion. I'm sorry. It's like SourceForge, but simpler and much, much, much more reliable. It's a very simple project hosting site. It's scalable. Provides source code version control, bug tracking, a wiki. some basic project functionality. You can register a new project, manage it, host the source code there. The cool thing is that the source code version control is Subversion, and it's Subversion backed off of Bigtable, which is basically the file infrastructure for Google. So Subversion has pluggable backends. We're basically blasting all the data onto the Google backend. That's pretty cool. It has about tens of thousands of projects. It's pretty impressive. And it's the second largest source code repository. If you're looking for a home for your project, it's pretty nice. It's got this googly, really nice looking UI. It's easy to use. code.google.com/hosting. You could add your project. In GNOME, we don't have this need for project hosting so much as other projects because GNOME provides a fairly decent infrastructure. But for those of you working on projects outside of the GNOME space, particularly if you're hosting things yourself or you're using another project hosting service that you're not happy with, check this out. I actually wasn't too familiar with this until I went to Google and I was like, wow, where's this thing been? It's pretty neat. Google Summer of Code. Oh, he's going to talk about that. Google Summer of Code is Google's annual summer program. It provides a stipend for hackers to do some work over the summer, have some fun, learn something new. But more than that, it also provides a system for organizations to bring in some students and get some work. We have over 6,000 applications this year, of which we grabbed over 900 students. I think we were earlier saying it was around 800. Well, we extended it, and there's now over 900 students. There's over 100 organizations. Organizations are the broader umbrellas which pick multiple students and bring them in and usher them. Those organizations include Beagle, GNOME, Mamo, Mono. There's probably others in the GNOME ecosystem that I'm missing. And those 130 organizations are providing over 1,400 mentors. That's pretty impressive. If you're a mentor, can you raise your hand? I'm just curious. Wow. Keep your hands up. If you're a mentor on one of these GNOME projects or something I'm not listing, keep your hand up. Open offices can stay up. That's pretty impressive. All right, hands down.
How many students?
Yeah, it was that next. If you're a student, can you raise your hand? Not bad. Good luck to all the students here. So this thing's done something pretty neat. GNOME is a project. It's a nonprofit organization. It doesn't really have the ability to bring on summer interns. It doesn't really have, and when I say the ability, it doesn't have the easy ability to bring on summer interns. And so in some sense, Google's providing really just the outsourcing of managing summer work. And so these projects want to have a way for students to come in and do some internship. Google will handle the logistics. Google will provide resources. And Google will also pay them. In exchange, you guys, the organizations can manage the students, track their progress, have them work on something fun and interesting that's beneficial both to the student as a learning experience and the organization, and therefore open source as a code contribution. So here's a quick rundown of how it works. Students apply to a project with an application. The application is detailed. It tries to sell the student's project and the student, him or herself. And it says, hey, this is what I want to work on. This is how I'm going to do it. This is my time frame, etc. And the GNOME project has a set of mentors. They review the applications like, hey, I want this one. I don't want this one. A priori, GNOME can have a list of ideas and projects that they suggest students can work on, and they could highly favor those, or they could be looking for innovative new ideas from students. It goes either way. But the mentors accept applications. That comes back to Google. We do a ranking system. The mentors provide a rank. We go through a ranking system, and we allot students and mentors to organizations. Google will immediately pay the students $500 US. Then the student begins working with the GNOME mentor in the project. Midterm, there's a review, and if the mentor gives a thumbs up, the student gets $2,000 US. You continue working, and finally, if everything's cool and the project's been met to completion, the student will get another $2,000. There's also a T-shirt or certificate, which sounds highly valuable. And it's a great experience. And then all organizations receive, pass or fail, receive $500 for each student. An example student project is face detection. If you were in Larry Ewing's really cool F-Spot talk, he mentioned this. It automatically recognizes faces and then can tag those faces. Larry actually told me that the project may not be completed due to the student taking a job. So this might be a bad idea, but I think this is really cool. I mean, this is an example of a project that is difficult and challenging, yet it's probably attainable in 3 or 4 months. So it fits within a summer timeline. And an ambitious student can take this on. It's easily, the metrics are very clear. Either the face detection works reliably well and there's a UI in place, or there isn't. It's also broken up into concrete jobs. So you can implement the face detection algorithm separate from implementing a UI. And you could have these steps along the way. So this is a great example. And that's a picture of my girlfriend, Audrey Hepburn. Why do we do this? Well, we like to say it keeps students flipping bits and not burgers. I don't look at this as the same as a bounty. I think some of you have complaints against the bounty, that it monetizing open source or converting what's altruistic incentives into money isn't necessarily a good thing. But I don't look at this at all. Even if you agree with those concerns, I don't think this is at all the same situation. Because what we're trying to do is to give students an alternative, which is contributing to an open source project instead of having to take on a summer job. And I think that's pretty cool. So we're not just directing open source work in a certain area and paying people for it, but we're hopefully getting that work to be done that wouldn't be done in the first place because students would be taking on a less economically productive summer job. It gives the students valuable experience. We've heard back from students, even students not interested in working for Google, that having this thing on their resume really helps them get a job later on down the road. You can all hear me, right? All right. It provides open source projects with more coders. That's great. It provides Google with a set of talent to possibly look at having a job, although this is in no way a recruiting tool. We could certainly spend our money better. But I think most importantly, it's Google's way of giving back. We're not, as I said, a traditional open source company, so we're not funding 200 people to package and work on a distribution or contribute to GNOME. But at the same time, we are using open source, and this is a way that we can give back. I have some neat summer of code statistics that you may or may not find interesting, but I'll blow through them. This is from last year, 2006, but we had 456 schools represented from 90 countries. Here's the distribution of accepted students. You could see United Kingdom at 40 is actually pretty impressive. This would be a lot more interesting if it was normalized for number of students or something. But here's the applications per country. Again, the United Kingdom is looking at like a 25% acceptance rate. The average graduation year last year was 2007, so that would have meant most of the students tend to be incoming seniors. And most of them are undergraduates, but that's not a very useful metric since most students are undergraduates. There's much more undergraduates than graduate level students. So again, this would need to be normalized. But that's some interesting stuff. This is pretty neat. If you go to code.google.com/soc/soc_map.kml, you can download a KML file. KML is an open, Google-created standard for map data. I actually think Google Maps can read it now, but if you have Google Earth, which runs on Linux, you can plug this thing in, and you can see the whole globe, where all the students are located, where all the mentors are located, and then there's lines drawn from mentor to student. This is I zoomed in on England. You can see, anyone see their name on here? No? I think that's pretty neat. And this is for this year. This is current. Another thing is that we see majors that have nothing to do with computer science. We have urban planners, astronomers, geneticists, developmental psychologists. I it says cartography. I didn't know that was a major, but that's pretty cool. And so you get people, contributing that it's outside their scope, and that's really interesting. I think if we couple this sort of Google Summer of Code data with larger studies on why people do open source, it dissuades a lot of the myths behind open source. At the very bottom of this list is dislike, distrust of proprietary software. There's a lot of people who do it primarily for that reason, 11%. But the vast majority of people are doing it for intellectual curiosity or skills improvement. And I think that says a lot about the motivations behind open source, and particularly how this Summer of Code project, why it works and why it's good. So to all you mentors in here, thank you. To all of you non-mentors, consider being a mentor next year. We hope to do this again next year. Hopefully it'll be even bigger. So the more mentors GNOME has, the more students that we could send your way. And so the student or two in here, you better be hacking. I want to point out that I stole a whole lot of slide material from Chris DeBona, who's my boss, and from Rob Pike, who's a principal engineer at Google, and the dude who did Plan 9. So that's it. Questions? Alex. I work on the Linux kernel. I'm in the open source program office working under Chris DeBona on Linux kernel work. Everything I do will eventually be open sourced. I am not working on our platform infrastructure, but an unreleased product. And I will not answer any questions about unreleased products. So don't even ask. I'm going to let this guy control the question, Destiny.
Hi, I'm Alex.
Hi.
How come you guys, for the local storage API in Google Gears, why didn't you just implement the spec local storage API that Firefox already implements?
2 reasons. One is our effort started before that spec was out. And the second reason, and I'm just guessing, is maybe we didn't like it. I honestly don't know.
Hi, I'm Alex too. I'm not so much into computers, but giving only some of the source to the people, to the public, seems like only half the truth, which would be like none. So do you really believe that you could call this an open source project?
Well, I don't believe that Google as a whole is an open source project. I do believe that large chunks of Google are open source. I don't think it makes sense in any way to open source key parts of the Google infrastructure. The Wiki Foundation's trying to do an open source search engine, and so if that's what you're interested in, go for it. But Google's just not going to be able to open source its secret sauce and keep a fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders. I want that guy.
Yeah, I mean, the network services that Google provides, like, say, search, is obviously different to providing desktop software, like, say, Picasa or Google Earth, which is like a DRM application, in that that's a stated reason why Google asks free software re-implementers of Google Earth clients to stop working on that. So I was wondering what your response was to the proprietary desktop software which Google ships to users.
I would like to see it more and more of Google's desktop software was open source. I think a lot of us would. And hopefully that's something that my office, the open source program office, can change. And certainly going forward, I think you'll see more and more open source, like Google Gears, coming from us. But yeah, I agree completely. The more that we could open source on our software level, the better.
Hi. I just wanted to make a little comment on the Summer of Code. Last year, I mentored Matthew Garrett.
I'm around? Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. I love Matt.
It didn't quite work out in that the project wasn't really accepted by the upstream, because we were actually working on something that I didn't have that much control over. This year I took a slightly different approach. I don't think that I actually put forward working on Bluetooth for GNOME, but some people seeing the results from last year thought that it was a good new project. I ended up roping in Marcel Holtman, who's the Bluetooth maintainer for the kernel and pretty much all the user space. So I just wanted to say that you don't need the person, the mentor, to be a GNOME person for them to be accepted as GNOME mentors for the Summer of Code, and I think that it could be really helpful draining the swamp. So if you know people that could mentor on applications and on infrastructure that GNOME would use, for example, working on X drivers, on kernel drivers, on an awful lot of those services, that's something that's possible with the Summer of Code under the GNOME umbrella.
Yeah, great. I actually thought you were going to go the other way and yell and say we didn't do a good enough job of making sure mentors are with projects, but okay. I agree with you. Alex again.
Alex.
So I was mentored to 2 years ago, and the student actually kind of just disappeared in the middle. That's not to say that the project or the Summer of Code is a bad idea. I think there was some outside factors. But I'm just wondering if you guys have any stats, or are you publishing any stats with regards to people who are new contributors who partake in Google Summer of Code and then continue to contribute in the community after the Summer of Code, and sort of what the conversion percentages are?
That's interesting. We do a bunch of surveys through the year. I don't know the answer to that question. I will say we do a bunch of surveys. There's student surveys and mentor surveys, and we do these to collect data that's helpful for the open source community. In fact, we have people who work on writing these web apps to do these surveys and then compiling this into useful data. So, solely so we could just dump this to the community as a benefit. So that's something I'll take back, and if we're not putting that into the mentor survey, we should. Or maybe do a post-mortem with mentors some number of months after the whole summer is over, and take a reflection and actually ask the mentor, hey, is the student still around? That would be good. Because that's definitely the key. If we could have the students actually more engaged before, had a productive summer, but even more importantly, they're now contributing to open source, that would be great. Any others? All right, well, thank you very much.